Alexander, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Hasmoneans, Herod and his heirs, Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, Augustus, Vespasian, Titus, Hadrian. Discussions of the world of the New Testament and Second Temple Jewish literature are littered with these and other dynastic lines and personal names. It seems therefore useful to offer an overview of the history of the territories relevant to, for example, Jesus and his ministry, as a background to delving into the study of particular texts or the life and ministry of Jesus himself. The treatment here will be necessarily brief. Those interested in a fuller account of the period may wish to consult my recent book, Judea under Greek and Roman Rule, published by Oxford University Press in 2024. At just under 200 pages, even this is a quite condensed account of this history compared to some alternative resources. The story told in the historical books of the Old Testament extends into the Persian period, with the waves of Judeans returning from exile in Babylon, resettling Jerusalem and its surrounding territory, and rebuilding the temple and the city walls, as recounted in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Between 334 and 332 BC, Alexander the Great, ruler of the kingdom of Macedon that had already unified Greece under his command, seized control of the regions of Asia Minor, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. By 323 BC, Alexander had conquered the remaining territories of the Persians and lands even further east, but succumbed to a fever in Babylon. His ambitious generals tore his empire apart and were enmeshed in wars against one another as each tried to win a larger share of Alexander's original empire for himself. Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals and successors, had secured Egypt, Cyprus, and Palestine for himself by 302 BC, founding a dynasty that would endure until the suicide of Cleopatra VII in 31 BC. The Ptolemies would retain control of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee through 200 BC. They invested substantially in rebuilding the cities of the coastal plain, which had suffered a great deal since Alexander's initial invasion because of their military and commercial importance. They also planted military colonies in Galilee and the Decapolis as a safeguard against invasion by their rivals to the north, the kings of the Seleucid Empire, so named after its founder, Seleucus I, once a general in Ptolemy's employ. Their primary interest was in the agricultural resources and other wealth that could be extracted from Palestine, allowing a substantial degree of autonomy under the high priest and the Senate, a council of elders drawn from the Judean elite, as long as the tribute flowed in the assigned amounts. Antiochus III, ruler of the Seleucid Empire from 226 to 187 BC, brought Ptolemaic rule over Palestine to an end. After a failed attempt to wrest this territory from Ptolemy IV in 217 BC, Antiochus succeeded in capturing this territory in 200 BC, when Egypt was under less effective leadership and less able to mobilize its resources. The Judean leadership in Jerusalem appears to have been ready for a regime change, as they were remembered to have welcomed Antiochus III into their city and provided local military support for his siege of the Ptolemaic garrison there in Jerusalem. Antiochus reciprocated with formal decrees granting Jews throughout his realm the right to follow their ancestral laws, which they had enjoyed anyway, and granting the people of Jerusalem 3 years exemption from tribute for the sake of the city's economic recovery. Antiochus III's ambitions brought him into conflict with Rome as he sought to extend his empire further west. After a decisive defeat at the Battle of Apamea in 188 BC, Antiochus was forced to pay an enormous war indemnity to Rome in order to avoid giving them a pretext for military action against him and his heartland. His son, Seleucus IV, who reigned from 187 to 175 BC, would spend his whole reign under the shadow of this ongoing debt, which was only fully paid off in 173 BC. Seleucus IV was succeeded by his younger brother, Antiochus IV, who reigned from 175 to 164 BC. Under Antiochus IV, some truly watershed events took place in Judea. First, a party of Judean elites eager to advance a more progressive agenda for Jerusalem appealed to the new king to replace the high priest Onias III with his more progressive younger brother, Jason. Further, they appealed to him to allow Jerusalem to shift its internal polity from one based on the law of Moses to one based on a Greek constitution. Thus, Jerusalem was essentially refounded as Antioch at Jerusalem, and a gymnasium was built for the education of Jerusalem's elite youth in Greek language and culture, and the introduction of Greek forms of exercise and athletics. Jason's party pledged an enormous increase in annual tribute to Antiochus, so confident were they of the economic growth these changes would invite. In 172 BC, however, an even more progressive party within Jerusalem secured Antiochus's consent, with promises of still higher tribute, to replace Jason with an even more radically Hellenizing high priest named Menelaus. Menelaus proved unable to make good on these promises and fell back on appropriating the sacred vessels of gold and silver in the temple to use as bribes to secure reprieves, resulting in open rioting against him in Jerusalem. Antiochus was busy himself during this time, 169 to 168 BC, defending his southern border against an incursion by Egypt, which he followed up with an attempt to gain a foothold for himself in Egypt. A rumor that he had been killed in these efforts led Jason to attempt to regain his office. He brought an army of mercenaries against Menelaus, but fled upon hearing that Antiochus was alive and now marching toward Jerusalem. Whether Jason had help within the city, or whether more conservative parties in the city used his attack as an opportunity to try to repel both Hellenizing high priests, Antiochus interpreted the situation as Jerusalem revolting against his duly appointed deputy, and thus against his own rule. He engaged in a shock and awe campaign of massacres and home invasions against its people, and restored control of the city to Menelaus. Menelaus himself conducted Antiochus into the temple's inner chambers and treasury to confiscate whatever he felt was his due in back tribute. Antiochus went further, however. He left a garrison of his own soldiers in Jerusalem as a peacekeeping force, who fortified their position in a structure known as the Acra, probably south of the temple and north of the city of David, in a position to oversee and exercise control over both. In the face of continued resistance, Antiochus pursued a program of forced assimilation. He made continued observance of the law of Moses, including circumcision, Sabbath observance, and keeping kosher, a criminal offense to be punished with extreme prejudice. In 167 BC, in keeping with the multi-ethnic population of Jerusalem, made so particularly by his own garrison, he rededicated the temple itself to other deities alongside the God of Israel, apparently going out of his way to shock Jerusalem's residents into acknowledging the new order of things, for example, sacrificing swine on the altar. This would be remembered as the abomination of desolation, or the desolating sacrilege of Daniel 11 verse 31 and chapter 12 verse 11. But the language is also used in the historical book 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 54. Judeans were forced to participate in Greco-Syrian rites and in the civic feasts that followed, thus to eat food that had been sacrificed to idols, even the meat of swine that had been thus sacrificed. These measures only served to galvanize resistance further. It emerged in its most effective form in the town of Modin, about 20 miles west of Jerusalem, under the leadership of a disaffected priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons, the most famous of which was Judas Maccabeus. Antiochus had taken the greater part of his army into Babylonia to reassert control over the eastern provinces of his empire. This allowed the guerrilla band that first formed around Mattathias and after his death around his son Judas to wreak havoc on apostate Judeans and on detachments of the local Seleucid peacekeeping force. As Antiochus's deputy, Lysias, continued to send insufficient forces against Judas's band of insurgents, the latter grew better armed, more confident, and in numbers, till they became a formidable force themselves. By 164 BC, first Antiochus, before his death that year, and then Lysias, who was made regent of the young Antiochus V, were more inclined to negotiate with Judas than to continue hostilities against him. Judas and his forces continued the fight until they regained control of the temple in Jerusalem, removing all the defiling and offensive paraphernalia, and saw to its ritual cleansing, putting it back in the service of the one God. Lysias essentially made peace with the situation, even executing Menelaus for his part in the deteriorating relations between the province and the empire. And then he turned his own attention to internal threats to himself and to the young Antiochus V. This marked the beginning of the civil strife within the Seleucid Empire that would thoroughly weaken and a century later eventually end that empire. Indeed, at this point, the son of Seleucus IV, Demetrius I, the person who ought to have succeeded his father but was preempted by Seleucus's brother Antiochus IV, established himself on the throne. He killed Lysias and the young Antiochus V and installed a new high priest in Jerusalem, Alcimus, who seemed to have an acceptable pedigree. Judas, nevertheless, continued his revolution, perhaps already believing that national independence was possible. He would, however, be killed on the battlefield in 160 BC. Judas's allies and armies latched onto his brother Jonathan as their new leader, who surprisingly led them to several further victories against the forces that Demetrius I had sent. Demetrius's general came to terms with Jonathan, who essentially set up a rival government at Michmash to the one in Jerusalem. When Alexander Ballas, alleged to be another son of Antiochus IV, arose as a rival to Demetrius I for the Seleucid throne, both figures vied with one another for Jonathan's support. Jonathan sided with Alexander and was made high priest and deputy over Judea as a result. Further intrigues led to Jonathan's capture and death, and his last surviving brother, Simon, emerged as the leader of the cause of Judean independence. He sided with Demetrius II against the pretender who had caused Jonathan's death, and was himself rewarded with the high priesthood, the lifting of tribute from Judea, acknowledging Judea thus to be an allied state rather than a vassal one, and the removal of the Seleucid garrison from Jerusalem. Thus, Jewish sources remember 141 BC as the year that Judea regained its independence after 456 years of foreign domination. With Simon, the Hasmonean dynasty, the family of those through whom deliverance was given to Israel, as 1 Maccabees 5 verse 62 celebrates them. With Simon, the Hasmonean dynasty was firmly established. Power transferred seamlessly to his last surviving son, John Hyrcanus I, after Simon's murder by an ambitious son-in-law in 134 BC. The opening years of John Hyrcanus' reign show that Judeans and Seleucids had different ideas concerning just how independent Judea had become. Antiochus VII, who succeeded Demetrius II after the latter had been captured by the Parthian Empire to the east, besieged Hyrcanus in Jerusalem for almost a year in an attempt to reassert his sovereignty over Judea. Hyrcanus eventually acquiesced and, a good vassal once again, marshaled his army and accompanied Antiochus VII on a punitive expedition against Parthia. The latter's death on this campaign in 127 BC, however, freed Hyrcanus to reassert Judean independence and to engage in a decades-long campaign of Judean expansion into Samaria and western Galilee, even into the Golan, through conquest and settler colonization. Hyrcanus was succeeded first by his oldest son, Judah Aristobulus, who reigned only for 1 year between 104 and 103 BC. He was then succeeded by Hyrcanus' third son, Alexander Jannaeus, who reigned from 103 to 76 BC. Both Judah Aristobulus and Alexander Jannaeus continued their father's expansionist policies, pushing further into Upper Galilee, the Golan, the Transjordan, the Decapolis cities, and the cities of the coastal plains. By the end of Alexander Jannaeus' reign, the Hasmoneans' realm equaled or exceeded that of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah at their height. Both Hyrcanus I and Alexander Jannaeus had invested in constructing several fortresses at strategic positions, chiefly near borders, which would remain important features of the landscape through the early Roman period. There was a great deal of internal opposition to Alexander Jannaeus, led largely by the faction of the Pharisees, who had been alienated from positions of influence by Alexander's father, Hyrcanus I. Jannaeus' cruelty in suppressing such resistance brought the dynasty to a new moral low. At his death, Alexander Jannaeus entrusted the kingdom to his widow, Salome Alexandra, who reigned from 76 to 67 BC. The high priesthood, of course, fell to Alexander's older son, John Hyrcanus II. Salome maintained the kingdom's borders, but engaged in no attempts to expand it. She reconciled her government with the members of the Pharisaic party, who used their newfound power to persecute their Sadducean rivals. As a result, Salome entrusted her border fortresses to the Sadducees, in large measure to spare their lives. As she herself was declining, she shared the powers of government with Hyrcanus II, her older son, who was eventually to succeed to the kingship as well. His younger brother, Judah Aristobulus II, however, was not content to be passed over. He rallied his supporters, which included the many Sadducees who had been entrusted with the border fortresses, and set about initiating a coup before his mother had even died. Hyrcanus II's position was the weaker one, with the result that he abdicated in favor of Aristobulus II after a military defeat near Jericho in 67 BC. An Idumean named Antipater, however, the son of the man whom Alexander Jannaeus had made his governor in Idumea, came alongside Hyrcanus II and urged him to reclaim his birthright. Antipater brokered the military support of the Nabatean king to the southeast of the Hasmonean kingdom and led them against Aristobulus II in Jerusalem. It is precisely here that Rome poked its nose under the tent. Pompey the Great had been engaged in reorganizing the client kingdoms and other territories in the eastern buffer zone between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. He sent a deputy south into Palestine to reconnoiter the region. He found Judea erupting into civil war and interposed himself. Both Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II presented him with their claim to the throne, and he decided in favor of Aristobulus, probably because he was in a stronger position to make good on his promises of bribes, and because it was easier to drive away the Nabatean army than to besiege Aristobulus in Jerusalem. Antipater, however, would not allow Hyrcanus to give up, and so they presented their case to Pompey himself when he came as far south as Damascus. Aristobulus, of course, was also on hand to assert his rights, as was a delegation from Judea asking Pompey to end the dynasty of priest-kings entirely and return the land to rule by a high priest and a council of elders. Pompey ordered both parties to keep the peace until he could investigate the situation more thoroughly. Aristobulus took this as a sign that Pompey might decide to unseat him and prepared his forces for a siege. Pompey, of course, regarded this as an act of aggression, if not also a personal affront, and he besieged Aristobulus in Jerusalem, eventually gaining access, placing Aristobulus under arrest, and planting Hyrcanus as the more reliable person to rule. As Aristobulus's soldiers had taken up their position in the temple, Pompey thoroughly inspected it for stragglers, even inspecting the Holy of Holies itself, an act that was hardly auspicious for the beginning of Rome's relations with Judea. Pompey appears to have heeded the delegation of the citizenry as well. Hyrcanus was not allowed the title of king, but only that of ethnarch and high priest, and the authority of the Judean Senate was increased. He removed many of the territories that Hyrcanus's ancestors had conquered from his domain, placing them directly under the Roman governor of the newly created province of Syria, to whom Judea would also pay an annual tribute. Hyrcanus and Antipater proved reliable allies in terms of upholding Rome's interests in the region. Even though Aristobulus and his sons were taken to Rome as prisoners of war, they would not cease from finding opportunities to escape, rally support back home, and instigate a series of civil wars against Hyrcanus and Antipater. In regard to these uprisings, Rome would generally prove a reliable ally in terms of lending military aid to its duly appointed ethnarch. Antipater's rise to power as Hyrcanus's right-hand man allowed two of Antipater's sons also to become prominent generals and deputy governors in Judea and Galilee. These sons were Phasael and Herod. Herod was particularly quick to learn that the path to long-term success was to distinguish himself as someone who could make Rome's regional interests his own interests. He, like his father and Hyrcanus, was also marvelously adept at adapting his loyalties to whoever emerged as Rome's representative in the East. This was no easy matter. as Rome's leading citizens were enmeshed in civil wars from about 49 BC through 31 BC. First, it was the clients and the armies of Julius Caesar against those of Sextus Pompey, Pompey the Great. Then it was the armies of Caesar's partisans, Mark Antony and Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus, against the armies of Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. Finally, it involved the armies of Octavian against those of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII of Egypt. Each successive victor, however, recognized in Herod a willingness to serve Rome's interests unwaveringly. The aging Hyrcanus recognized Herod's potential and sought to secure him as an ally for his family rather than see him emerge as a competitor. He betrothed him to his granddaughter, Mariamne, thus bringing Herod into the Hasmonean fold. The union, promised in 42 BC, would not be consecrated until 5 years later, however. The Parthian Empire had been pushing against Rome's eastern frontier for some time and was also intent on creating its own proxies in the region. They made such an arrangement with Mattathias Antigonus, the last surviving son of Aristobulus II, and advanced on Jerusalem. Hyrcanus II was taken prisoner, and his ears were cut off to disqualify him from ever holding the office of high priest again. Herod's brother, Phasael, killed himself to avoid worse treatment at the hands of his enemies. Herod himself was forced to flee with several members of his family and many of his supporters, whom he left at the fortress of Masada, traveling himself to Rome to seek aid. Rome's chief representatives, at this point Mark Antony and Octavian, knew that they could not allow Parthia to call the shots in Judea, so they threw their whole weight behind Herod as someone whom Rome could trust with the region. Herod was proclaimed King of the Judeans and ally and friend of Rome by the Senate in 40 BC. It would take 3 years, however, for Rome's forces to be in sufficient command of the border with Parthia to turn their attention to dislodging Mattathias Antigonus and installing Herod in Jerusalem, which they did in 37 BC. Though Herod had been active during this time with the forces entrusted to him, both fighting for Rome's interests on the border and harrying Antigonus's forces in Judea. Initially entrusted with Judea, Idumea, Perea, and Galilee, Herod's competence won him several additional grants of territory from Octavian, who was better known as Augustus after the Senate awarded him that honorific title in 27 BC. These additional territories included Samaria, the cities of the coastal plain, several of the Decapolis cities, and the largely Gentile districts northeast of Galilee, Gaulonitis, Trachonitis, Batanea, and Auronitis. As a layperson, Herod had to delegate the office of high priest to others, generally to the member of a priestly family whom he most trusted to support his own rule and agenda. As a client king, Herod could not engage in campaigns against neighboring regions in an effort to gain territory. Rome's firm control of the region, however, also meant that Herod would not waste his resources in defensive wars or civil wars against rivals for his throne. His ambitions were, as a result, channeled almost entirely toward the improvement of the territory that Augustus had allotted to him, which he did magnificently. Herod left hardly a corner of his realm untouched by his ambitions as a builder. Many of the archaeological sites throughout Israel are testimonies to the more constructive and often inspired side of this complicated figure of history. These include Caesarea by the sea, Sebaste in Samaria, improvements to the fortress palaces throughout his realm, for example, Masada, Machaerus, and Cypros, as well as the creation of new fortress palaces like Herodian and the citadel at Jerusalem. Also, new palaces outside of Jericho, and most famously, the complete renovation, rebuilding, and expansion of the temple complex at the heart of Jerusalem. Herod changed the landscape of the historic territory of Israel more than any other single ruler. Herod also aspired to achieve the international status and recognition of a generous Hellenistic ruler. He subsidized the costs of building a gymnasium and theater in Damascus, porticos, temples, and marketplaces in Tyre and Berytus, modern Beirut, a colonnaded street in Antioch on the Orontes. His gifts reached Pergamum, Delos, Rhodes, even Athens itself. Herod was able to finance all of this activity and beneficence because of the vast and varied resources at his disposal. First, he enjoyed significant income from the vast private estates he inherited in Idumea from his father Antipater. Second, he had the income from the royal lands throughout his territory at his disposal. These included large portions of the Jezreel Valley and the oases of Ein Gedi and Jericho, fertile land that had been claimed for the imperial power since the Persian period, and that had been exploited in turn by the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Hasmoneans. Third, he collected a variety of taxes, including a poll tax levied on each adult person, adulthood being initiated at 14 for males and 12 for females, a tax on land, and taxes on goods that crossed his borders in any direction. The last of these was particularly profitable, sometimes levied at 25% of the value of the goods themselves. Herod's control of sizable stretches of land routes and his new maritime port of Caesarea by the sea gave him substantial opportunity for revenue from such import and export taxes. At the same time, Herod's building projects certainly gave a boost to certain sectors of the population. Long after the major work was finished, his temple project was still keeping 18,000 people employed. Herod's family life, on the other hand, was a disaster. A good deal of the dysfunction came from the fact that his royal-blooded Hasmonean relatives never accepted the Idumean commoner as one of them. As a result of the distrust and the bedroom conspiracies, Herod would execute his old patron, Hyrcanus II, his young brother-in-law, Aristobulus III, his second wife and love of his life, Mariamne, Mariamne's mother, and 2 of his own sons by Mariamne. His oldest son, Antipater, the fruit of his first marriage to the commoner Doris, whom Herod divorced as a precondition of marrying into the royal line, also fell afoul of his father and was executed just days before Herod himself expired of a wretched and wasting disease. Days before his death, in 4 BC, Herod drafted a will naming his eldest surviving son, Archelaus, ruler of Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, as well as the coastal cities, the lion's share of his kingdom. Antipas, his next oldest, was to be given oversight of Galilee and Perea. Philip, another surviving son, was to be given the diverse northeastern territories. Archelaus was removed for incompetence in AD 6, just 10 years later, and banished to Gaul. At this point, his territories came under the direct Roman oversight of prefects, officials drawn from the second tier of Roman society, the equestrian class rather than the senatorial class. These prefects enjoyed broad judicial and military powers, policing powers, and were entrusted with the collection of taxes and the protection of Rome's interests in the region. They also inherited Herod's right to appoint and depose high priests, a fact that no doubt continued to degrade the authority of that office in the eyes of many Judeans. The prefects were themselves answerable to the governor of the Roman province of Syria, to whom their subjects would occasionally appeal for judicial redress, and to whom the prefects and later the procurators might appeal for additional military support. The most famous of these prefects was, of course, Pontius Pilate, whom Tiberius assigned to this post from AD 26 to 36, an unusually long time, though in keeping with Tiberius's personal preference for longer terms for provincial governors and prefects and the like. He appropriately quipped that it was kinder to allow the same fleas to live on a particular dog, since once they were full, they would suck lesser amounts of blood than to change out the fleas too often. Caesarea Maritima was chosen as the new administrative center. Its location on the seacoast made for faster communication with the governor of Syria, whose capital was Antioch on the Orontes, easily reachable by sea travel, and communication with Rome itself. Founded by Herod the Great as a Greek city, it was also culturally and religiously more appropriate to the administrative staff and the military cohorts that would be stationed there. Judea and its surrounding territories experienced a brief return to Herodian rule between AD 41 and 44, when the Emperor Claudius awarded these territories to Herod's grandson, Agrippa I, who had previously been granted the territories of his uncles, Philip and Antipas. Agrippa's early death meant a return of all those territories, now including Galilee, to direct Roman rule, now under officials that would bear the title procurator. From AD 44 through 66, these Roman appointees showed increasing ineptitude and venality. The period was marked by a variety of simmering tensions that frequently reached a boiling point. These tensions were not all directed against Roman figures, though the procurators seemed largely incapable or uninterested in resolving them. Tensions between Samaritans and Judeans flared, erupting into significant exchanges of violence on one occasion. Gangs of bandits became more numerous, largely as a result of people being forced off their lands and deprived of any reliable means of sustaining themselves and their families. Tensions between the Jewish and Gentile residents of Caesarea Maritima reached the breaking point several times in the 60s, often with the Jews getting the worst of it. Finally, Gessius Florus, procurator from 64 to 66, acted with such a high hand that explicitly anti-Roman actions became inevitable. He sent his auxiliaries into the temple complex to appropriate massive funds deposited there, probably in compliance with Nero's orders to his deputies everywhere to raise money by any means for the restoration of Rome after the Great Fire of 64. He let the same auxiliaries loose on the citizenry when they dared to protest, going so far as to crucify Judeans who were also Roman citizens. When the governor of Syria failed to respond to the Judeans' appeal for redress, they took matters into their own hands. Sacrifices on behalf of the emperor were suspended. The bridges connecting the Antonia fortress to the temple were destroyed. A band of insurgents captured Masada and raided its substantial stockpile of arms to equip themselves and others. Judeans overwhelmed and killed the cohorts left guarding the Antonia fortress and the Praetorium, Herod's former palace in Jerusalem. The governor of Syria, hearing of the unrest, mobilized his troops, gained the upper hand against any resistance he met in Galilee and Judea, and initiated a siege of Jerusalem. The revolt could have been ended then and there, with far less bloodshed and devastation, if he had but pressed the siege. He lifted it, however, and began to move his troops to Caesarea, presumably to spend the winter there. As he retreated, however, the insurgents came out from the city and inflicted such casualties upon his rear guard that Rome was honor-bound to strike back with all its might. A provisional revolutionary government was established in Jerusalem, led by its priestly elite and generals appointed to make preparations for the inevitable onslaught. They had a year before Nero's appointee for the task of suppressing the revolt, a seasoned general named Vespasian, arrived at the head of 3 legions, as well as the auxiliary armies of regional client kings, a strike force of 60,000. Within a year, they had eradicated all active resistance in Galilee, Idumea, and Judea, save for the city of Jerusalem itself. Only Nero's death by suicide in AD 66 halted the campaign, as a Roman general's mandate ended with the death of the emperor who issued it. The power vacuum in Rome led to a year of civil war, as the generals of the legions in Spain and Germany supported their own candidates for emperor. The legions in Spain supported their general Galba. The legions in Germany supported their general Vitellius. Within Rome itself, a senator named Otho was supported by the aristocracy and the Praetorian Guard. Finally, Vespasian himself entered the contest, with the legions from the east fighting on his behalf. This year of civil war, this year of the 4 emperors, ended with Vespasian established as the last man standing and the founder of a new dynasty. This year proved to be disastrous also for Judea. Rather than use the reprieve to develop a unified front and invest fully in the fortification of Jerusalem, rival revolutionary parties made war upon one another within the city, and all of them preyed upon the common folk. They burned one another's stores of grain and other supplies in an attempt to weaken their rivals' positions. It was not until early summer of AD 70, when Vespasian's son Titus encircled Jerusalem with 4 legions, that the remaining revolutionary leaders came to terms and focused on the real problem. With the siege initiated, starvation quickly began to set in, followed by disease as the bodies of the dead were too numerous to contain. Titus finally mobilized his forces to breach the walls, making their way to the Antonia fortress and thence forcing their way into the temple, a principal stronghold of one of the revolutionary parties. In the process, the temple itself was set ablaze and destroyed. By September, Titus's forces had gained control of the whole city. Jerusalem was largely destroyed. Tens of thousands of Jews were sold as slaves. Thousands more were earmarked to die in gladiatorial shows throughout the province of Syria and back in Rome itself. perhaps hundreds of thousands, had perished in the siege. As a consequence of the revolt, the province was reorganized. Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and Perea were broken off and made an independent senatorial province with a full resident legion, rather than a mere 5 or 6 cohorts as under the procurators. The remaining pockets of resistance in the fortresses of Machaerus, Herodian, and Masada were efficiently dislodged and neutralized. Several new Roman colonies were created to provide the veterans of the army with their hard-earned reward, including Neapolis in Samaria, modern Nablus. For all the devastation, economic recovery appears to have been quick. Vespasian had already set many of his soldiers to work rebuilding Galilee in 68. Judea itself sustained little damage outside of the capital city. The suppression of the first Jewish revolt was an important achievement for Vespasian, the newly installed emperor, and for his line, and it would serve as a resource for Flavian propaganda for 2 decades. The Senate awarded Titus a triumphal procession upon his return to Rome. The triumph itself was commemorated in a triumphal arch erected at the eastern end of the Roman Forum after Titus's death and divinization. This later triumphal arch features the famous scene of some of the furnishings of the Jerusalem temple, the menorah, the table of the showbread, and the trumpets being carried as part of the procession. The seizure and parading of these items might have been understood to signal, in the manner of other ancient conquerors carrying away the images of the conquered people's gods, the triumph of the gods of Rome over Israel's God. The Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, itself sported an inscription claiming it to have been financed with spoils appropriated in the wake of the Jewish revolt. The victory was celebrated in several coin mintings under both Vespasian and Titus, and these circulated far and wide throughout the empire, giving the Judean defeat a long life in the public memory. These coins proclaimed the conquest of Judea, Judea capta, Judea taken. The formation of Judea as a new independent province, no longer a sub-province under the jurisdiction of the Roman governor of Syria, helped to formalize the fiction that the Flavians had somehow contributed to the preservation and even the positive growth of the empire, alongside inflicting significant destruction in their civil war against the armies of Vitellius. Many such coin issues feature the territory of Judea, personified as a woman, weeping beneath the date palm that was a well-established symbol of the region, or alternatively, weeping at the foot of a Roman trophy, often with a Roman military figure, perhaps Vespasian or Titus himself, standing triumphantly behind her. By AD 120, Judea became a consular province with a second resident legion, more likely with a view to strengthening its defensive capacity against the Parthians to the east than with a view to fending off further revolutionary activity, though that would come. The Emperor Hadrian made a tour of the eastern provinces in 130 to 131 AD. One of his goals was to strengthen and improve these territories. Jerusalem, still essentially in ruins from the first revolt, cried out for his attention. He decided to rebuild the city with a view to making it a colony worthy of the veterans of the 10th Legion Fretensis and the active legion still stationed in the southern half of the city. His goal, however, was to make it a proper Roman city, not restore its native character and temple. It would be known henceforth no longer as Jerusalem, but rather as Aelia Capitolina. Aelia was a form of Hadrian's family name. Capitolina was a reference to the Capitoline gods worshipped on the Capitoline Hill overlooking the ancient Forum in Rome. These plans became a flashpoint for a second revolt, the rallying cries for which, represented on coins struck by the rebel government, was the liberation of Jerusalem and perhaps the restoration of its temple. Neither was, of course, to happen. The revolutionaries started out strong as the revolt broke out in AD 132. There were no divisions between rival leaders and their gangs. One charismatic, capable, and uncompromising man stood at the helm from beginning to end. His name was Simeon Bar-Kochba, though he would soon be given the messianic moniker Simeon Bar-Kochba, son of a star. He led a guerrilla campaign, making use of extensive networks of tunnels by means of which his bands could appear out of nowhere, attack quickly, and disappear without a trace. By such means, he inflicted heavy damage upon the resident Roman forces. Hadrian, however, appointed his most trusted general and put 5 legions and various detachments under his command. This general patiently and methodically isolated and eradicated Simeon's forces. The revolt finally ended in another prolonged siege, this time a siege of the smaller city of Bethar near modern Beitar, a few miles south of Jerusalem. The human costs of the second revolt were high on the Roman side, but disastrous on the Judean side. Fighting had been largely limited to Judea, but had resulted in the destruction of hundreds of its towns and villages and the decimation of its population. Hadrian resumed construction of Aelia Capitolina. The southwest quarter of Jerusalem, including most of the upper city, remained the camp of the 10th Legion Fretensis through 300 AD. 2 new forums were built in the city, one in the northeast and another in the center west. The latter included a basilica for judicial business and temples to the Capitoline gods of Rome, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and to either Venus or Fortuna. It is likely that a temple or at least a shrine to the imperial cult was erected atop the Temple Mount itself. The construction of these forums significantly changed the topography of Jerusalem, not to mention its character, which was now completely Roman. Hadrian imposed 2 symbolic punishments on the native population. Jews would henceforth not be allowed to enter what used to be Jerusalem, save on the 9th of Av to mourn their losses, and the province would henceforth bear the name Syria Palestina, distancing the territory from the Jewish nation, its revolutionary past, and the ideology that fed it.